Put Senator Byrd's statement, his last appearance before the Senate Rules Committee. I was there before he died, where he urged us not to break down this fence. Excerpts from Senator Dodd's farewell address. I'd like to ask consent for all those to follow my speech.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President,
Senator from Illinois.
ask consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
I ask consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I recently had an opportunity to visit Cuba for the first time. I have been frustrated for many years about the impasse between the United States and Cuba. I have believed and continue to believe that the best way to change the Castro regime in Cuba is to open Cuba. As we learned in Eastern Europe, when those who have lived under a controlled economy and autocratic rule are exposed to the real world and the opportunities of that world, they start pushing for change. I went to Cuba hoping that with the transition of leadership from Fidel Castro to his brother Raul, there might be an opportunity to turn the new page. President Raul Castro has taken a number of small but notable steps toward opening up his country's economy. He has also released a number of political prisoners, albeit forcing many of them to leave Cuba if they wish to be released. Yet a genuine start to turning the page with the United States would also have to include the release of a detained United States citizen, Alan Gross, a man you as presiding officer have met with, as I have. Today marks the third full year in prison in Cuba for Alan Gross. What was Alan Gross's crime? He provided Internet equipment to some of the Cuban population. That's right, Internet equipment. Mr. President, you may have read that in war-torn Syria, under the ruthless dictator Bashar al-Assad, the Internet was recently turned off for a few days, but was restored. In fact, Internet access in Cuba is between 1% to 3%, making it among the lowest rates in the world. The Cubans have tried to exclude news from the outside world to those living on the island. In 2011, the Cuban and Venezuelan governments, two governments not known for political freedom, launched a much ballyhooed project to lay an undersea fiber optic cable between the two countries to help improve Cuba's telephone and Internet services. The $70 million project was expected to be in operation for the entire nation by the summer of 2011, but as of May 2012, reports indicate the use has been restricted only to Cuban and Venezuelan government entities, and Internet access by the general public still remains slow and very expensive. It's no wonder that trying to use the Internet in Cuba can land you in jail. But 15 years in jail for American Alan Gross? Mr. President, I've come to this floor many times to plead for his freedom. I'll continue to do so. Gross's incarceration is a tragic reminder of the stale, tired policies of another era. It's difficult to imagine how relationships between the United States and Cuba can improve while Alan Gross continues to be held as a hostage to the contrived grievances of the Cuban government. Today, December the 3rd, marks the third anniversary of Alan's detention. 3 long, painful, and damaging years. 3 years. However, that's only a small fraction of his 15-year sentence. Alan is a 63-year-old man from Maryland who simply wanted to give basic communication tools, just a shadow of what average Americans enjoy every day to the Cuban people. He went, when he arrived in Cuba, with all of his equipment, through their customs, handed over everything that he had brought in, which they dutifully inspected, and then proceeded to allow him to leave with the equipment, and then turned around and arrested him for being a spy, trying to sneak something into the country. He had fully disclosed everything he'd brought in. He didn't believe he was violating the law. It's a mere technicality that has him sitting in prison today. Now he's fighting for his life, trying to sustain his emotional and physical health. And that's a growing concern. When I met with Alan Gross, he explained to me his daily routine. It's the only thing that keeps him sane. He gets up and marches around his room, pacing off the feet as they go to try to make sure he walks a certain distance each day. They let him outside in the sunlight for a little while each day, and he tries to do exercises outside to maintain his physical condition. Recently, they found a mass on his shoulders. Cuban doctors diagnosed it as a hematoma and said it would go away, but it hasn't. It's a source of growing concern. His family's worried that it may be worse than just a hematoma, perhaps even a tumor. And Alan Gross repeatedly has asked for a doctor of his own to examine him, but Cuba has refused. Facing outside pressure, Cuban doctors recently took another biopsy of the mass and made a big effort to publicly announce last week that their tests concluded it wasn't cancerous. But Alan and his doctor here in the United States are not satisfied with the methods the Cubans used and don't trust the results. Just last week, Judy Gross, Alan's wife, came to see me again. She's been in before. She talked about her worry and the worry of her family about her husband's condition. Who can blame them? Alan's daughter and mother are both battling cancer. He has reason to fear that he could have it too. Alan deserves a medical evaluation from a doctor he knows and believes in. Cuba should at least give him that. Furthermore, they should allow the examination to take place in the United States so that he can visit his ailing mother and daughter. I have pleaded with them to give him a chance to come home. One of the Cuban Five, a group of 5 Cubans who were arrested for suspected violence and terrorism, they were given that opportunity to return to Cuba so that they could visit a sick brother. During my visit to Cuba, I had the privilege of meeting with Alan in person, and I thank the Cuban government for that visit. I was moved by our conversation and impressed by the sincerity of Alan's affection for the Cuban people. This is a picture that was taken during the course of my visit with Alan. Alan Gross is not a threat to the sovereignty of the Cuban government, as they claim. He's a good man with good intentions, an honest man who just wants to come home to his family. Instead, he's trapped in Cuba now for 3 years, being used by a regime as a pawn in a standoff with the United States. Holding Alan Gross as a political hostage is the wrong way to solve any problem between our countries. I'm no fan of this Cuban regime. Its disregard for human rights and basic freedoms trouble me greatly. The recent suspicious death of Cuban democracy leader Waldo Paya and continued harassment of blogger Yoani Sanchez are deeply troubling. But I believe in the Cuban people and in their right for economic and political expression. I am inspired by the passionate and courageous activists on the island, those who follow the example of Paya and Sanchez. I'm hopeful they will break through the repression and bring real change to that country. Today, Senators Cardin and Moran introduced a resolution calling for the immediate, unconditional release of Alan Gross. I support it and join as a co-sponsor. Call on my colleagues to do the same. Last week when I met with Alan's wife, Judy, it almost broke my heart. She's fought tirelessly for her husband's release, and her pain is palpable. Like Alan, she is frustrated. But she continues to fight for his freedom and works hard to ensure he's not forgotten. Judy Gross, I assure you, Alan is not forgotten. I hope the Cuban government takes note of the same. Alan Gross deserves to come home, and we will continue to fight for him until he does. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. President,
The senator from Arkansas.
I ask unanimous consent that the order for the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the men and women who wear our nation's uniform are selfless heroes who embody the American spirit, courage, honor, and patriotism. We must always remember to honor those who risk their lives to protect our country because our troops have given the greatest sacrifice in defense of our freedoms. Today, I am here to pay respects to Army Sergeant Joseph A. Richardson, an Arkansas soldier who sacrificed his life for his country while in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. As a student at Bentonville High School in Boonville, as a student in Boonville High School in Boonville, Arkansas, Sergeant Richardson took an interest in the military. His guidance counselor told Arkansas media outlets that during his sophomore year, he became interested in military service and was anxious to take the necessary entrance exams even before he could qualify. He felt like it was going to be an honor to serve his country. In 2008, he joined the Army. His passion for his service to his country remained constant. Sergeant Richardson's family said he loved his job, he loved fighting for his country and freedom. He liked it so much, he recently re-enlisted for 6 more years of service in the Army. While Sergeant Richardson's desire to serve his country was well known, so was his enthusiasm for life. His family and friends described Sergeant Richardson as a kind-hearted man who always put others first and made those around him laugh. As a member of A Company, 1st Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, Fort Riley, Kansas, 23-year-old Sergeant Richardson gave his life for his country on November 16, 2012, while on a patrol in Afghanistan. Mr. President, Sergeant Joseph Richardson is a true American hero who paid the ultimate sacrifice. I ask my colleagues to keep his wife Ashley, the rest of his family and friends in their thoughts and prayers during this very difficult time. On behalf of a grateful nation, I humbly offer my sincerest gratitude for his patriotism and selfless service. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. And I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Iowa.
I ask that the calling of the quorum be suspended.
Without objection.
Before I speak, I ask unanimous consent that Yuan Liu, a health care fellow in my office, be allowed privileges of the floor for the remainder of the 112th Congress.
Without objection.
Okay. I ask permission to speak in morning business.
Without objection.
America faces no greater threat to its growth and prosperity than our uncontrolled national debt. Currently, the country's debt exceeds $16 trillion. We're passing this amount of money on to our children and grandchildren to pay off. It's simply far too large of a burden to be placing on our grandchildren and children. As we move forward, it is clear that we must discuss spending. I know that President Obama is hyper-focused on increasing taxes, part of the deficit reduction proposal. However, if we're serious about reducing our debt, we must talk about spending, not sometime next year, not only after we talk about taxes. We must talk about our spending and talk about it now. We need to have a thoughtful conversation that focuses upon where our federal spending most calls for control and containment. I'd like to begin by drawing your attention to this chart that we'll put up here. This chart from the Congressional Budget Office, so it's not something I've put together, details non-interest spending as a percentage of gross domestic product. We already know the significant role health care spending plays in our budget. Over the next decade, the federal government will spend over $7 trillion on Medicare and $4.5 trillion on Medicaid. Together, these two programs account for 1/4 of the entire federal government spending throughout the next 10 years. But look closely at an even longer-term projections of our spending. You have health care spending here growing over the next 25 years. You have Social Security relatively flat, and you have non-interest-bearing spending up and down, but fairly even. But you can see the tremendous growth over the next 25 years in health care spending, which is growing very rapidly as a percentage of GDP compared to, or as a percentage of budget as compared to the other two categories. So let me repeat that. The middle graph, which is Social Security, as a percentage of GDP, will remain relatively stable over the next 25 years. Non-interest-bearing spending, which is the bottom graph, as a percentage of GDP, will also remain relatively stable over the next same period. Now, if you look at the top graph, over the next 25 years, spending for health care entitlement will be basically double as a percentage of GDP. And I'm just now reminded that I said at one time this was a percentage of the budget, but in both of my explanations I should have said as a percentage of GDP. Mr. President, unless we take a serious look at health care spending, we aren't genuinely acting to reduce our country's debt. 25 years, as this chart looks ahead, is not a lot of time. It may seem like a lot of time in our lifetime, but it comes upon you very, very quickly. We need to be talking about health care spending and talk about it now, not sometime next year, not just once that we've discussed taxes, right now. In Washington, we can get all wrapped up over semantic terms. Do we need Medicare and Medicaid reform? Should we call it restructuring, reorganization, or maybe call it improving and strengthening? Doesn't matter, Mr. President. The terms that we might use in describing it are irrelevant, and the conclusion is undeniable. We must gain control of health care spending. As we move forward in debt talks, I know a lot of attention will be devoted to taxes and revenue. Those conversations are very important and should conclude with tax policy that fosters economic growth. But conversations about health care entitlements should not be postponed or relegated to some second-tier status, particularly when this very day they amount to about 44 cents of every dollar that the federal government either gets in taxes or borrows. In other words, we spend. And they certainly should not be confined to cost reduction exercises that ignore fundamental cost drivers. And I think that's the most important thing I ought to leave with you, as what I say next will exemplify its importance. We talk about cost reductions, but what's more important in health care is to not ignore the fundamental cost drivers. I have read reports of the savings in Medicare and Medicaid that President Obama has proposed. I'm not finding fault with his proposals. I'm just saying that won't be enough. In my mind, they do a little more than take cash out of the system without making fundamental changes necessary to bend the growth curve. Let's take a look at a few of those in President's 2013 budget. There's increasing the income relating of Medicare premiums. That one takes more money from rich seniors, and I don't argue with that point. There is increasing co-payments for home health. This will increase cost to all seniors. Now, that one I might argue a little bit with, but I'm not going to say it shouldn't be on the table. They're getting bigger, there's another suggestion, getting bigger rebates from drug companies, even if it harms Part D. That one takes money from the drug companies. There's cutting provider taxes in Medicaid. That one will take money from states at a time when the administration is encouraging them to expand Medicaid to cover childless adults. As an aside, I noted that the Washington Post had a banner editorial last Friday supporting a reduction of Medicaid provider tax. I wish that the Post had been so helpful in 2006 when the Bush administration made a similar proposal. There is also something called the blended rate for state reimbursement under Medicaid. That breaks the promise to pay for 100% of the cost of those made eligible under Obamacare. Mr. President, these proposals will certainly reduce the federal outlay in Medicare and Medicaid, and so I suppose should be applauded, even if there's some dispute about them. However, these proposals will not solve the larger problem of health care spending growth, the growth that we're talking about here in the top part of this chart. Instead, we should also focus on where our spending really is taking place. I'm fully aware that there is significant opposition from Democrats to Republican ideas like premium support for Medicare and block grants for Medicaid. I'm not here today promoting either one of those ideas, but opposition to those ideas should not allow Democrats to walk away from this issue of changing or of stopping this, or of, I should say, of making fundamental changes that stop this growth that we're having here, a growth that we can't sustain. We must address the growth of health care entitlements, in other words. I believe our Medicare and Medicaid spending problems can be explained in three straightforward charts. And we'll put those charts up here, and I'll go into depth about those charts. Here we look at federal Medicare and federal and state Medicaid spending divided into three groups. On the left is spending by the federal government for people who are eligible only for Medicare. On the right is federal and state spending for people only eligible for Medicaid. In the middle is the federal and state spending for people eligible for both Medicare and Medicaid. These folks are sometimes described as dual eligibles, or sometimes just by the one word, duals. This middle group, the duals, account for just over 10% of the entire Medicare and Medicaid population. However, there is more spending on duals than on Medicare-only beneficiaries and Medicaid-only beneficiaries. When we talk about the need to find ways to control spending on duals, it is for a good reason. We must find ways to realign the disparate incentives of the federally run Medicare program and the state-run Medicaid programs. However, focusing on solutions exclusively to the dual eligibles misses the fullness of this problem. For one, the dual are not an homogeneous population. While most people consider people on Medicare to be typically elderly, fully 30% of the duals are non-elderly. Also, while many of the duals are clearly high cost, there are a larger number of duals who utilize very few services. So while the improvements to the care model that we use for duals are necessary, they are far from sufficient in reducing the totality of the growth driving health care costs. We have another chart. In this chart here, we find the most expensive individuals in the Medicare program. This is a population who has 2 to 3 chronic conditions and functional impairments. Among the most expensive Medicare beneficiaries, more than half, as you can see, 57%, qualify for only Medicare. Providing better coordinated care and reducing costs for high-cost beneficiaries is critical for the future of Medicare and Medicaid. I have strong reservations about splitting these two groups based solely on individuals' income. Proposals that give the states greater control over acute care services for the 43% who are duals essentially divides two similarly situated, expensive individuals between one federal model and 50 different state models based solely on their income. This makes no sense. A Medicare-only beneficiary may exhaust income and assets and become dually eligible. The separation between the two populations is arbitrary as well as artificial. Whatever we do to find a better model to coordinate care and reduce costs for high-cost beneficiaries, we need to address all beneficiaries, not just the dual eligibles. To find rational solutions to our health care spending, we must first accurately target the populations who incur the most significant expenditures. This includes individuals who are not only the duals, but also those Medicare-only seniors with multiple chronic conditions and functional impairments. Finally, I'd like to draw your attention to my last chart. This chart details spending on long-term services and supports for the year 2010. 2 years ago, a total of $208 billion, 8% of all U.S. personal health care spending, was spent on long-term services and supports. Among this spending, Medicaid, the single largest payer of such services, picked up 62.2% of the cost, while the private market paid for just over a third of this total cost. With 80 million baby boomers entering retirement age and 7 out of every 10 seniors needing long-term care at a certain point in their lives, the demand for those services will only increase and further drive health care spending if we don't take action. We must find ways to increase private spending and decrease public spending on long-term services and supports. If we're going to argue that we are reducing the growth of health care costs, we must then, as people expect, actually do it. So, Mr. President, in closing, we have an opportunity before us. We can either make real changes in our health care entitlements that will impact the growth curve for years to come, or we can simply take cash out of the system and call it reform, as the President proposes. And members of Congress propose that as well, so I don't want to just blame the President. We have to be willing to re-examine the effectiveness of our current overall Medicare and Medicaid structure. We should not be afraid to ask tough questions. Should Medicare and Medicaid be structured in a way that provides benefits to individuals in the most efficient and effective way possible? Are Medicare and Medicaid, in fact, structured in a way that guarantees we spend federal and state dollars inefficiently or ineffectively? When you look at the spending on duals, the spending on high-cost beneficiaries, and the spending on long-term support and services, I believe the answer to both questions is yes. In other words, the money being spent is spent inefficiently and ineffectively. Medicare and Medicaid proposals must address these three concerns. President Obama hasn't come to the table yet. I know that there are people telling us we shouldn't talk about health care entitlement now. We don't have a choice. Look at the numbers that I put up in the first chart. Look at the spending. We only make the problem worse the more days or years that we put it off. We can save federal dollars by extracting more from beneficiaries, providers, and states, but that won't bend the long-term growth curve. We have to talk about solutions to actually lower the growth curve and talk about it right now. We are $16 trillion in debt. One out of every $4 that we will spend in the next decade will be on Medicare and Medicaid. We will see health care entitlement double as a percentage of GDP in the next 25 years. If we want Medicare and Medicaid to not only survive, and I do, I think it's part of the fabric of America, but also thrive for the next generation, and we should want that, we need to be willing to ask fundamental questions and seek solutions that can affect the growth curve. I sincerely hope that we will be willing to look for solutions that can make a real difference, and I intend to come to the floor a few other times in the next few weeks to discuss this issue with my colleagues. I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
Senator from New Hampshire.
With consent that the order for the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I appreciate your role and leadership as well on that committee, I would like to speak for a few minutes on the National Defense Authorization Act. In the midst of an ongoing war with our brave sons and daughters, husbands and wives fighting in Afghanistan, our country continues to face a very serious threat from radical Islamic terrorists and other challenges and threats throughout the world. And with increased threats posed by rogue states like Iran and North Korea, it is so important that we pass the Defense Authorization Act. I would like to take a minute to thank Chairman Levin and Ranking Member McCain for their leadership, for the hard work and dedication they have shown in bringing us together around this defense authorization. This in a place where we typically have seen many times where things have come down on party lines. I can tell you that the Senate Armed Services Committee is a welcome exception to the gridlock and partisanship in Washington. And both of them have brought us together, and in fact the Defense Authorization Bill passed out of the Senate Armed Services Committee unanimously. It reflects the committee's bipartisan commitment to making sure that our troops and their families have what they need to ensure that our nation is protected. As the ranking member of the Readiness Subcommittee, I have had the pleasure of working with Chairman McCaskill to ensure that our men and women in uniform have the resources that they need to protect themselves and our country. At the same time, the Readiness Subcommittee has also worked very hard to achieve significant reforms that save taxpayer dollars without endangering our military readiness. I look forward to continuing to work with the Chairman to seek additional efficiencies within the Department of Defense budget while guarding against irresponsible cuts that would leave our troops and our nation less prepared for future contingencies and increase the likelihood of conflict. I also want to recognize the work that I've had the opportunity to do with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that further support our troops, our veterans, and their families. I'm proud to have worked with my colleagues across the aisle to include several very important provisions in this year's Defense Authorization Act. During the markup, Senator Begich, McCain, Shaheen, and Senators Vitter and Udall joined me, 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats, working together to introduce and successfully incorporate an amendment to the Defense Authorization that would save $400 million by cutting off funding to cover the cost behind the behind schedule and overcost Medium Extended Air Defense System, or MEADS. This is a weapons program that the Pentagon has said it will never procure. It will never happen, and yet we continue to put taxpayer dollars to this weapons system. I know that in the President's comments about the bill, he's expressed concern over this, his administration has, but at a time where we are facing grave fiscal challenges in this country, we cannot afford to spend $400 million on a weapons system that will never come to be when there are so many other needs that need to be addressed. In another bipartisan effort, more than a dozen of my colleagues joined Senator Begich and I in ensuring that veterans buried at the Clark's Veterans Cemetery in the Philippines will have a dignified and final resting place that they deserve. There's still more work that we have to do on this issue, but what this comes down to is when the Air Force abandoned the Clark Air Force Base in 1991 in the wake of a volcanic eruption, the Clark's Veterans Cemetery was abandoned, and the tombstones and the remains of 8,300 U.S. service members and their dependents were left buried in ash and overgrown with weeds. Completely unacceptable for those who have served our nation that we would not ensure that this cemetery would be kept in the way that is dignified and consistent with the respect that they deserve, having served our nation. To prevent this from ever happening again, I'm pleased that the defense authorization includes the provision sponsored by Senator Begich and I, which would require the Secretary of Defense to provide Congress a plan to ensure that an appropriate federal or private agency assumes responsibility for the continued maintenance and oversight of cemeteries located on overseas military bases after they close. What happened here is that we left and there was nothing in place to ensure that we would take responsibility to make sure that this cemetery was maintained with dignity and respect. And this provision will make sure that if we're in that position again, that this does not happen. Additionally, Senator Jack Reed and I worked together to include a provision aimed at enhancing the Department's research, treatment, education, and outreach initiatives focused on addressing the mental health needs of members of the National Guard and Reserve. I'd also like to talk about, in addition to the provisions I've just mentioned, which we've been able to put in this bill on a bipartisan basis, some additional amendments that have already been included in the defense authorization. Here are some of the provisions or reporting requirements that are included within this bill. First, requiring the Pentagon to complete a full statement of budget resources by 2014 to improve financial stewardship at the Pentagon. This has been an issue that we have been working on for too long. It is time that the Pentagon is able to undergo an audit, and this requirement that is contained within the Defense Authorization Act is consistent with what Secretary Panetta has said that he is seeking to do, to make sure that the Pentagon can complete a full statement of budget resources by 2014. When we are at a time when we're $16 trillion in debt, the fact that we are not able to audit the Pentagon, aren't able to really take that information and make critical decisions on what we need versus what we would want to do and what we can afford to do, this is very important that the Pentagon get to a position where it can be audited. And this provision of making sure that this critical step is in this bill, and I'm hopeful that it will get passed. Additional provisions that will save millions of dollars in acquisition dollars by prohibiting the Department of Defense from using cost-type contracts for the production of major defense acquisition programs. That's in this bill. We can't afford the years where we are paying much more for weapon systems than we can afford, and it takes much longer to produce them. And we can improve our acquisition systems, and by prohibiting the Department of Defense from using cost-type contracts for the production of major defense acquisition programs, this is a very important step. There are also provisions in this bill to ensure that our nuclear deterrent remains strong as we modernize our nuclear arsenal. Without a nuclear deterrent, if you look at what's happening around the world with Iran trying to acquire the capability of having a nuclear weapon, with North Korea having that capability, it is very important that we have that deterrent in our country and that it remains modern and able, if God forbid, we hope we would never have to use that, but it is a very big deterrent to rogue actors around the world who are seeking this capability. In addition, provisions that increase oversight over the Department of Defense's proposed reduction in the number of soldiers and Marines, and looks at the issue of minimizing involuntary separations. One of the things we're facing right now with the defense cuts is that some of our men and women in uniform who have served multiple tours on our behalf are now in a position where they may receive a pink slip. We owe it to them to make sure we minimize the situation where they come home, they're given a pink slip, and then they are put in a situation where they're looking for a job. We need to make sure that we do this in a way that they can assimilate into the civilian society without being left unemployed, given the sacrifices that they've made to our country. Other provisions I'd like to highlight briefly: a provision to ensure that military amputees have access to top-quality prostheses and prosthetic sockets. Whether service members who require prostheses choose to leave the military or continue to serve, they deserve the best top-quality prosthetics and prostheses sockets, and included in this mark is a provision will ensure that there are standards to ensure that they receive the best. They deserve it. In addition, a provision that will require the Navy to let us know what do our current military capabilities require in terms of the number of ships and submarines that are in our fleet. The Chief of Naval Operations testified last year that the Navy needs 313 ships and submarines to meet its strategic requirements. Right now, we only have 285, and if sequestration goes forward, we're going to have dramatically less. And we can only meet 61% right now of the requests that are made by our combatant commanders. The administration has said that we're going to shift to the Asia-Pacific region, given the rise in the investment that China is making in its Navy. And so I'm just simply asking that the Navy tell us what is it that you need to meet our needs to make sure that our country is protected. We've got conflicting information, and it's really important that we have a strong and robust Navy to make sure that America is protected from the threats that we face around the world. In conclusion, I want to just thank Chairman Levin and the Ranking Member McCain for all of their hard work and their leadership on the Armed Services Committee. This is a bill that we can be proud of. I'm also pleased that the Senate last week adopted my amendment to ban the terrorists that are being held at Guantanamo Bay from being transferred to United States soil. I know that's something that the American people feel strongly about. But this bill overall, I know, will continue to have debate on a number of amendments. This is a bill that's very important to our service members, their men and women in uniform that serve us and their families. They deserve the very best. They deserve to know that we will pass this bill to make sure that they have the equipment and the support that they need, given the sacrifices that they have made for our country. Again, I want to thank Chairman Levin and Chairman McCain for all of their hard work. Thank you. I note the absence